Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. My name is Sarah Barnes. I'm from Cape Breton University. This paper is entitled Burnt Out, Angela James and the Construction of Athletic Fatigue. When Angela James was cut from the 1998 Olympic Games, Olympic women's ice hockey team, many in the national sport media viewed the decision as controversial. It was a dramatic choice because the 1998 Games represented the first time that women's ice hockey would be included as a medal event. A veteran and star player at 34 years old, James, who was often referred to as the Wayne Gretzky of women's hockey, had had an unusual rise to the top of her sport. As a Black woman and lesbian, she had competed at the highest level in a setting that was often considered to be the birthright of white, straight boys and men in Canada. James grew up in a single-parent household in Flemington Park, a public housing project in Toronto, Ontario. After being kicked out of a boys' house league at the age of 8, she soon joined a church-operated girls' league. At 14, she started to play in the prestigious Ontario Women's Hockey Association. She was an 8-time most valuable player at the Women's Hockey National Championship and captain of the highly successful Seneca College women's program. James's uncanny ability to score goals drew accolades and praise on an international scene for more than 2 decades. In 1997, in the year before James was cut, the National Film Board of Canada attempted to document the momentous 6-month lead up to the Olympic Games by creating a documentary called The Game of Her Life. This documentary featured interviews, behind-the-scenes coverage of players and coaches as they prepared for the Olympic competition. Rare on-ice footage was woven together with scenes of athletes working out, attending team meetings, traveling, and going about their daily lives. James attracted a lot of attention in this documentary as questions loomed large about her status on the national team. In one scene, set in a training camp, a narrator's voice ominously observes that while the rookies felt, quote, buoyant after surviving another round of cuts, elsewhere on the team, there is fatigue, illness, and anxiety. The camera immediately cut to James in the head coach's office in the middle of a serious discussion. Head coach Shannon Miller explains to James, it's not a matter of someone's tired or not feeling well, because the truth is we're both sick and tired, and so is half the team. And there are just no excuses, end quote. Miller encourages James, it's all about attitude. I think you have it in yourself, but you have to bring it out. James was on the bubble because the coaching staff could not tell if she was emptying her tank, giving it 100%. Did James have the right attitude? Was she in good enough shape? Was she too old? Would she hurt the team's chances of winning a gold medal? This paper is informed by 2 academic conversations. First, it fits into feminist conversations about the landscape of women's hockey in Canada and longtime struggles to create more space for girls and women in this sex-segregated setting. This includes the work of Nancy Thurberge, Carly Adams, Julie Stevens, Charlene Weaving, and Jenny Ellison, among many others, who have highlighted the difficulty of securing funding, opportunities, fair pay, safe working conditions, and equitable media coverage. Second, this paper draws on conversations around an emerging field called critical sleep studies that dissects a current cultural obsession with rest, burnout, exhaustion, and sleep, all of which have a heightened profile in the COVID-19 pandemic. According to Google Trends and data, searches for burnout have reached an all-time high in the US. Concerns about medical community, teachers, essential workers, students, parents, caregivers, who are all trying to navigate chronic and acute stress of living in COVID-19. Yet, as feminist scholars like Patricia Vertinsky have noted, Anxieties about physiological processes like burnout or fatigue are not singular to this moment, but rather these elements become visible in relation to power and help to reveal and rationalize bodily and social hierarchies in different times and places. This work also is sort of nestled within a broader project that does study the rise and implications of a promotional sleep culture in sport. At the turn of the 21st century, this is a moment right before the rise of a multi-billion-dollar global sleep industry, new types of tracking technologies, an explosion of scientific interest in athlete sleep. In fact, it's possible to see how the desire to create more room in the Olympic program for women's ice hockey coincided with the reproduction of hypermasculine narratives that naturalize and celebrate tiredness and athletic exhaustion as signs of work ethic, personal commitment, and above all, legitimacy. These ideas reinforce the notion that sleep and being well rested is an individual responsibility. Yet by looking at the coverage around Angela James, we can see that it's a more complicated story. How do we account for the way that some athletes get worn down moving through sport systems that were not intended for them, at least historically? How does one quantify the compounding and intersecting forms of poverty, racism, sexism, and homophobia that James encountered inside and outside of the sports system? These questions prompt reflection on what it means for the aspiration for women's sports to reproduce the dominant performance models of men's sports, but with fewer resources and different historical burdens. An often underrepresented detail in accounts surrounding James's dismissal from the Olympic team was that she was heavily fatigued. She had lost a lot of weight and she was not playing to her usual level. More than a year later, Toronto Life reported that in a medical examination prior to the national team tryout, James had learned that she had suffered from Graves' disease, an autoimmune disorder that often mimics the symptoms of overtraining when it presents in athletes. During the 1998 camp, James was on medication and managing her condition. And even though the coaching staff understood that James was negotiating this fatigue-inducing illness, the major lines of discussion around the athlete, at least in the National Film Board documentary, continue to emphasize her attitude, her work ethic, and her ability to overcome tiredness. And while major sections of the game of her life really accented inequities between men's and women's hockey teams, the documentary did not dive deep into how intersections of race, class, and sexuality help to shape differences among the female players or within a broader market-driven high-performance sport context. The appearance of corporate sponsors and the commodification of a small number of athletes from the Olympic hockey team, especially those who were perceived marketable for their ability to fit into racialized and heteronormative beauty standards, was seen as proof of the growing legitimacy of the sport. So there was sort of this very famous photo shoot with the goalie Manon Ramon and Don Cherry. And this photo shoot is sort of seen as really glamorous. And it wasn't at all troubled for its ability to reproduce normative rather than resistant narratives about women's hockey. And while some players on the Olympic team received lucrative endorsements, most had to manage on the $1,854 a month they received from the Canadian Hockey Association. Many members of the women's hockey team were on leave from full-time jobs or school. They billeted with local families or rented very small apartments near the rink. Many found themselves in very precarious financial and housing conditions as they were fighting for months and months for the position on this national team. And such constraints may have made the potential for sponsorship and corporate sponsorship and commercialization of the sport even more inviting. And so, as we find out in this movie, James did not come from a comfortable middle class background. And she had, at this point, was sort of reflecting on 10 years of professional ice hockey career and the difficulty that she had in finding rest or recovery. James talks to the camera as she lifts weights alone in a fitness center in this one scene. Quote, I was working and playing ice hockey. I basically didn't know what a holiday was all about. All of my holidays have been about ice hockey competitions. James had to balance her athletic career with another full-time job, and over the course of the decade, she would have had less time and fewer financial resources to devote to recovery as compared to many of her teammates who came from middle-class backgrounds and families who could help them out. One of the ways that social privilege is reproduced in sports systems that are designed around physical exhaustion and individualized health discourses is that vulnerabilities to overtraining and burnout are not distributed equally among athletes. Individualized concepts of health encourage people to be more responsible for their own health. Yet in practice, these modes of governing elevate the individual and reduce collective aspects of health in ways that strengthen existing social and economic inequities. Discourses of personal responsibility obscure the fact that not all athletes have the same types of opportunities to be well rested or to eat well, and that not all athletes share the same health risks or vulnerabilities when it comes to overtraining. It was never exactly clear why James was cut from the 1998 Olympic team. In public statements by Coach Miller labeled James as, quote, a defensive liability. There was no discussion of her autoimmune disorder. And immediately rumors about lesbianism and affairs among the coaching staff and players clouded the discussion. Instead of coming to the athlete's defense, many in the Canadian public attacked James's conduct and compared her public frustrations to the class that was shown by the millionaire NHL player Mark Messier, who had also been dismissed in the Canadian Olympic men's team. In a letter to the editor published in the Globe and Mail, it read, quote, funny we didn't hear these rumblings from Mark Messier, surely one of the best Canadians to ever play the game. End quote. Media narratives about James and her dismissal from the national hockey team took on racialized tones as she was portrayed as an angry Black woman. Reporters commented that James appeared, quote, distraught, angry, disappointed, and tired out after she was cut from the team. Despite the alleged colorblind nature of sport as portrayed in media, the bodies of Black female athletes are always already under suspicion in the normative public domain. Within the sports media, racialized female athletes are often depicted in ways that place them outside of dominant feminine norms through rhetorical strategies that hypersexualize them or portray them as possessing excessive physicality and, in this case, emotionality. James responded to the media and coaching decision by saying, quote, I feel I was set up and cheated. A dog would have been treated better. For most of her hockey career, James was adamant that racism was not an issue. But after being cut from the national team, James felt less certain about how racism had impacted her athletic career. She explained to Toronto Life, quote, you get these vibes. It's not something you can put your finger on. To understand James's story, we need to address issues of race and whiteness in hockey, heteronormativity and homophobia, and conventional beauty standards and body standards. But we also need to consider how shifting ideas about fatigue, sleep, overtraining, and the health of athletes combine to shape understandings of performance and assessments of athletic ability. Sport is a complex site where individual bodies are read in multiple and shifting ways in relation to race, class, and gender. Subjective perceptions about individual effort and attitude and biological responses to training are always shaped by long-standing ideas about which bodies are seen as heroic or vulnerable in their exhaustion. We also need not forget how medical systems often fail Black women, in particular, as evidenced by Jennifer Brea's Sundance Award-winning documentary, Unrest. This film follows a 28-year-old Black woman and PhD student who contracts a fever and then essentially becomes bedridden with chronic fatigue syndrome. And through this story, medical professionals continuously doubt the legitimacy of her elusive condition. So thank you for tuning in.